Let's get peppy. This is episode 76, I believe, and we're back with Dr. Dave Smith. Tell us who you are, Dave, just in case we're really stupid.
I am Dr. David Smith from the University of Sydney.
And I am Chaz. Yep, and I am Chaz Ciadello from Planet America, the show that you can watch on iView or Facebook or YouTube or wherever, I don't know, stay outside the ABC studio if you want stalkers. Let's do some updates quickly. First of all, you talked about JD Vance. This is a one-line update from last week. You talked about JD Vance. You'll be pleased to hear he was caught paying social media influencers $15,000 a month to tweet about how awesome he is. That's very JD Vance. I'm not going to go into details, just little updates for people. Another update, the Georgia elections law, we've talked about it a couple of times. The weird one, which says, we've told you before about the 10,000 votes from people who voted in another county other than the one they lived in. And in Georgia, those are illegal votes. If you did it on purpose, that's potentially voter fraud in Georgia. Guess who voted in the wrong place? Herschel Walker's wife. Herschel Walker being the person who is about to run for the Senate representing MAGA country. His wife voted from Texas, even though in a Georgia election.
I will note, I don't agree with calling them illegal votes. And in fact, Brad Raffensperger, who's the Secretary of State, said that it is a disservice to call them illegal votes. They are votes. Well, the reason why I say this is they're votes that, yes, they are not complying with a particular law, but illegal would seem to imply that they can be disqualified. And there actually hasn't been any move to disqualify them. And the thinking seems to be that, yes, they may have infringed a law, but that doesn't make the vote itself illegal. It makes an action that someone did while they were voting illegal, but it doesn't make the vote itself illegal. It's not actually a ground for disqualifying those votes. That's
a subtle but important point to make. Personally, I don't mind as long as Herschel Walker's wife is at the front of the queue for whatever happens to people who do it. Another update, this is from last week's pod. I talked about Jeffrey Clark, the until now anonymous apparatchik in the Department of Justice who tried to single-handedly win Trump the election just before the riot and, at the end of 2020. Jeffrey Rosen, who was the acting Attorney General after Bill Barr left, testified to Congress about all kinds of stuff. We talked about some of the stuff last week. What came out after the podcast is that Jeffrey Clark, who had, if you recall, he wrote a letter he wanted to send to Georgia, essentially saying the Department of Justice has been investigating you guys in Georgia, and we believe that there is something untoward in the election, and so we invite the legislature to decide who they think won the election, which would just be just incredible, given that apart from anything else, there wasn't even an investigation going on at the Department of Justice. Bill Barr had already looked into it and found there was nothing wrong in Georgia. But it turns out Jeffrey Clark had drafted similar letters to every one of the state legislatures in every one of the swing states that Trump wanted to win in 2020. Wow. So we were just lucky that essentially, remember, after he went through this process, Trump tried to remove Jeffrey Rosen and replace him with Jeffrey Clark. So Jeffrey Clark would have then had the power of the Attorney Generalship to enact all this stuff. And the only reason he didn't was because Jeffrey Rosen threw a tanty and said, we're all going to quit if you remove me. And so then Trump backed down because he thought it'd be bad PR and it would distract from the stolen election. So we were this close to a genuine coup, like at least a constitutional crisis, at the very least. And none of us even knew it was happening at the time. It's actually quite scary in hindsight how easy it is to mess with this kind of stuff. And it makes you very nervous. Leaving aside all the laws that we're talking about, all this stuff happened under the current law. And it could happen again if the wrong people are in power at the wrong time. So that's a worrying update. A little update as well. I don't know if you listened to last week's podcast. You probably didn't, Dave, but I went on forever about the eviction moratorium, like literally forever.
What were you saying about? Actually, no, sorry. I regret
No. Don't get me started. Just go back and listen if you care, which I'm sure you don't. I just wanted to just say there's one thing which I noted in my notes when I was deleting all the things I went through that I didn't get to. It was amazing. There was something I didn't say because I say a lot. But there's something there's a point that I need to make, which is at some point in time, this moratorium is going to end, at some point in time. And presumably they're not going to get the rental assistance out in time because they've gotten $5 billion out of $47 billion in the last 8 months. So that's not going to change in the next month or two. So there are going to be evictions happening. Some people are going to get evicted at some point in time. I just want you to know that contrary to rhetoric, it's not going to be mass evictions all happening at once, just because of the process of evicting takes a while. And I'm not saying, oh, that's a silver lining. I'm just saying we just need to be aware of what's coming. Eviction takes weeks, sometimes months. In New York, the process takes 3 to 6 months alone. It's a lengthy process, and the courts are going to have an 18-month backlog to catch up on. So some of these people are going to be around for a while before they're evicted. But having said that, that does not make this any less of a terrible story, potentially, because once they are evicted, they're screwed. Because number one, their credit rating is shot because they've owed this money. Secondly, they'll never get a lease again because the past failure to pay rent is going to make it impossible for them to get a rental apartment somewhere else. So it's bad news, but just this is going to be a slow-moving disaster rather than a bang, like we're probably led to believe by some of the rhetoric in the last few weeks. Things we're not going to talk about on this podcast because I talked about in the show. If you're interested, we're not going to talk about Gavin Newsom. We talked about him on the show. I talked about the economy at length.
Kimberly Guilfoyle's ex.
Is that right?
Yeah, Kimberly Guilfoyle's ex.
That's the one. By the way, I probably shouldn't say. Look, have a look at old photos of Gavin Newsom and Kimberly Guilfoyle. They both looked very, very different 20 years ago. I know we all age. I looked different 20 years ago as well, but I haven't aged the way that they've aged. Let's put it that way. They've aged in a decidedly unnatural way, both of them. But anyway, we're not going to talk about him. We're not going to talk about the economy. I just want to note one thing about the economy that I didn't get into the show, which is, I think, important to note. Jason Furman, who is Obama's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, came out with a report during this week saying that wages and salaries, along with health, retirement and other benefits, fell in the last quarter. Even though they went up over quite a lot, they fell when you account inflation. And in fact, it's 2% below the pre-pandemic trend at the moment when you take inflation into account. But don't panic about inflation. I've said this many times on the show about the fact that there's going to be inflation for a while because the prices were flattened a year ago and they measure this stuff over a year. And so compared to 12 months ago, yes, there's a lot of inflation. And there's an adjusting period after the pandemic. The CPI climbed a seasonally adjusted 0.5% in July from June, but it was 0.9% increase from May to June. Core inflation, which excludes energy and food, rose by 0.3% last month. June, it rose by 0.9%. And that's at least partly because car prices have stopped skyrocketing. But the fact is inflation may well be topping out. We'll see. We'll need to see over the next couple of months. But there's certainly a bid from some people to try and create panic about inflation. If it keeps on going like it currently is, then there's a problem. But we need at least another 3 or 4 months to really know where we're at. So I just wanted to raise that there. Also, not talking about Chris Cuomo Andrew Cuomo. Chris Cuomo has his own problems. We talked about him at length. Unless you want to say anything about Andrew Cuomo. Do you want to say anything about him?
Why would I want to say anything about Andrew Cuomo?
I'll tell you, all I will say about him is we were just playing some grabs on the show just now because we record the show just at this moment.
Grabs is an unfortunate term.
That's a great pickup. He's the master of the grabs. He reminded me of Kaiser Soze from the Usual Suspects. He's got this patter going where he sounds like he's got some learning disability, but actually he's just a bad guy. It's just like the way he talks, I just thought that I was. He's got this rehearsed kind of, oh, little old me, I'm like Eeyore, I'm just like, I'm cute. Anyway, it's kind of bizarre. I just wanted to say, I wanted to ask you though about your opinion on the question which most pundits have been talking about. We're pundits about whether Democrats or Republicans police their own more effectively, because there's been a lot of point scoring this week about that off the back of Andrew Cuomo. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I would say on this issue, Democrats do police their own more effectively. I don't want to go overboard with praise for how effectively they police it. On other issues, not. You know, Ralph Northam is still governor of Virginia last time I checked. And I mean, even on this one, it did take quite a lot of pushing. It wasn't a sort of automatic process. You know, it took a report from a Democratic Attorney General to get this to happen. I do think Democrats definitely on this issue police a bit more effectively than Republicans. Al Franken is no longer in the Senate. But not on every issue. There's a separate debate over whether or not that's actually a good thing for Democrats. I think that it is a good thing.
I definitely think it is a good thing. I'm in two minds about it. Like I can think of one really. I'll get to this. I can think of one really good example, but I'll just note that Cuomo and Franken both have a situation where they were going to be replaced by a Democrat no matter what happened. So there isn't a lot of cost. There isn't a lot of cost for enforcing behaviour in either of their circumstances. But having said that, the Republicans have done a bit of that themselves. Eric Greitens in Missouri, he was going to be replaced by a Republican, and so they got rid of him. Robert Bentley in Alabama was the governor of Alabama. They got rid of him. He was obviously going to be replaced by a governor as well. For those who don't know Robert Bentley's situation, because it didn't get much press for some reason, I will just tell you very briefly about it because it is funny. I'll just tell you that he is the guy who was having an affair with his senior advisor, and he got caught by being recorded accidentally, and the recording came out. And on the recording, he said to his senior advisor that he was, quote, worried about loving you so much, and, quote, when I stand behind you and I put my arms around you and I put my hands on your breasts and just pull you real close, I love that too. First of all, what's it with these creepy governors and cupping breasts? They're all obsessed with it. Cuomo, Bentley, they love cupping breasts. But anyway, leaving that aside, he denied having an affair after that recording came out. He said their relationship was not sexual after that recording came out. Nice try, Governor Bentley. Anyway, they got rid of him because they could replace him. So I think the Dems and the Republicans are kind of even in that regard. As you say, they didn't push out Ralph Northam when they would have lost potentially the governorship, because the two guys beneath him who are Democrats both had their own problems. But I will give the Democrats credit on one, which was, there's one example I can think of, only one, that either party has gotten rid of someone who it was not in their obvious political interest to get rid of. And that was in 2017. There was a House rep called Reuben Kiwane, I think is the way you pronounce it, who sexually harassed one of his staffers. And Nancy Pelosi basically pushed him out. Like, she couldn't get him to resign, but she all but did that. She basically froze him out completely. He ended up not running again. And that was a swing electorate that the Democrats, that Reuben Kiwane had actually won from the Republicans. And he was a first termer. So they had a very real chance of losing that district in the next election by freezing him out. As it turned out, they did win the district anyway, so it actually turned out okay for them. But that was the only example I could think of going back where I could find either party who had actually gotten rid of someone who wasn't obviously going to be replaced by someone from that party. Which, you know, I can understand that. I mean, they're politicians. You expect them to act politically. I mean, really. Yeah. But sorry, what were you about to say? I interrupted you.
And what happened when Franken got removed? So, yeah, then there was a Democrat appointed in his place.
Tina Smith was reported to replace him. Yeah. Yes. And she's won re-election since then. Okay, now this episode is going to be a lot of COVID and Congress, and so I'd like to. Actually, before I do this, I want to throw to you, Dave, on the non-COVID Congress thing. I just want to do a quick lap of honour before we move off Cuomo. That my two least favourite Democrats of the last 4 years were Andrew Cuomo and Michael Avenatti. Anyone who listened to this podcast for the last 18 months knows I've hated vociferously both Cuomo and Avenatti for the entire time. So I just want to warn, I'm going to do A, a lap of honour, and B, I want to warn Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton that the evil eye is on you, so watch out.
I want to hear more about your anti-Italian racism.
My anti-Italian racism? Oh, you're right, of course. Avenatti and Cuomo, that's what it is. I'm such a cliche. My dad would be sadly nodding, saying, oh, I've known this for years. Anyway, but yeah, since this is going to be COVID and Congress heavy, I want you, Dave, to talk about the thing that you want to talk about that has nothing to do with COVID or Congress, which is everyone's favourite drug-addled pillow salesman, Mike Lindell. Tell us about him.
Yeah, so this is just getting weirder and weirder. Yes. So Mike Lindell, for a while, it was believed that Mike Lindell was just trying to scam everyone. So Mike Lindell has insisted that he's got all of this information that proves that over the internet, votes were actually intercepted by China and changed from Trump votes to Biden votes. And, he was claiming that he had information that proved that. But following the commentary on this, it seems to have shifted from, well, maybe Mike Lindell's trying to scam everyone, but it actually seems to be clear Mike Lindell is being scammed.
By who?
Mike Lindell actually does seem to believe that someone has given him these packets of data that show that the election was stolen. However, Mike Lindell, not being a computer guy, much more of a pillow guy, he doesn't know how to interpret this information. So Mike Lindell held this 3-day convention in South Dakota. You may have seen some very sad pictures of it from a live screen, which sort of started with a medium-sized room full of people, and by the end there were very few people, where he was promising this is where the information is going to be revealed. And, like all of these things, it wasn't just going to be a simple PowerPoint presentation with easy to understand information that would, show once and for all. Instead, mostly it was just lengthy rants by him about how toxic the media is. But then when it actually came to showing the information, it was completely incomprehensible, right? Oh. It was just sequences of characters and things like that. And it became very clear that Mike Lindell himself did not know what he was looking at, but he assumed that this was some kind of, damning evidence, and he was inviting people to inspect it. Now, of course, most of the people he'd invited along weren't in any position to assess the evidence as well. And to some extent, this is how the con works, right? You say to people who can't possibly interpret the evidence, look, here's the evidence. You can look at it yourself. It speaks for itself. But the problem is, of course, that Mike Lindell put a $5 million offer up saying anyone who can disprove Mike Lindell's cyber data gets $5 million. And for one of the people that Mike Lindell had actually hired to handle the technical side of his operation, this temptation proved to be too much. So let me just, get his name. Josh Merritt, known as Spider, or Spider with a Y, and who was hired by Lindell for his red team, told the Washington Times on Wednesday at the symposium that effectively Lindell has sold his adherents a bill of goods. Lindell claimed that intercepted network data obtained by other hackers, also known as packet captures, could be unencrypted to reveal evidence of vote switching by the Chinese-backed hackers. But Merritt has now said that's just not true. So our team says we're not going to say that this is legitimate if we don't have confidence in the information. So someone from Lindell's own team has now said, look, this is bullshit. And obviously now Lindell has not given him $5 million.
Well, Chuck.
Yeah, and Merritt says apparently the offer is no longer on the table, although, of course, on Mike Lindell's website, he still claims it's on the table. So I mean, this whole thing has been just debacle upon debacle upon debacle. Inevitably, there's always some excuse for why the evidence can't be produced. Someone had a medical emergency. Hackers who are trying to take down Mike Lindell, have disrupted his website. But it is just becoming so painfully obvious that there is nothing there. Like, not that any reasonable person ever expected anything to be there in the first place. But I think what has also become clear is Mike Lindell is actually the one getting scammed here by people who are claiming that they have evidence.
So is there a suggestion that Mike Lindell paid for this, inverted commas, evidence and got screwed?
He certainly got, I don't know how much he paid for it or whether he paid for it, but there were people offering him this, and I assume that they weren't offering it to him for free.
It's so, I mean, this sector of, like, this populist sector of the right, like where they have their chain emails and they're fundraising and they're grifting on each other. Like they do scam each other, these people. Yes. It is very much like the human centipede of scam artists.
It really is.
Just go down the line. It's
and I mean, Rick Perlstein's essay from 2012, The Long Con, it's well worth checking out. And it's interesting to read it now because it's actually, it's written, or it refers to a world that is actually very, very different from the world now. It's a pre-social media article. But I mean, this has been going on for a very long time, this kind of scammers preying on each other. And I mean, there's been this dynamic throughout with the whole Stop the Steal thing of people constantly saying, we're almost there. The evidence is just about to be produced. By the way, in Australia right now, it is August 13th. That is another one of the dates when Trump was supposed to get reinstated.
Ah, wow.
Yeah, supposed to happen today.
I'll check Twitter. Okay.
Yes. And I mean, I think that the Maricopa audit is just a slightly better organised version of this. We've been told for weeks now that a report is imminent. Instead, what we get is Republican senators in Arizona constantly insisting that they need more information, sending out more subpoenas, which are now just being ignored by other Republicans. I mean, it is getting to that stage of the con where it's getting harder and harder to keep it going because more and more people are just realising that nothing is ever going to be produced.
But importantly, we should say, I mean, this is obviously not great news for the people who believe in this stuff, but for the cynical people who have some control over at least some elements of it, who don't believe in it at all. This is an enormous success for them because they're not trying to prove that the election was stolen. They're trying to just create confusion. That's what they're trying. And they're trying to create a cloud of vagary, and that's what is left over. Just confusion.
It is, and I mean, when I read things by people who sincerely believe in good faith that there's evidence the election was stolen, part of it is that they don't know what that specific evidence is or is supposed to be. They've just seen all of this sort of vague-looking stuff, which they can't interpret, but they assume that there must be something there, right? So they hear about, in Michigan, there were 200 pages of affidavits. Like, yes, there were 200 pages of affidavits, and they were pretty much all garbage. They were all talking about normal parts of election procedures that whoever wrote the affidavit didn't understand them, or they were completely unsubstantiated allegations. But the impression that a lot of people have who have fallen for this scam is that there's just so much evidence and it's so overwhelming and it's so complicated that it can't possibly be assessed, or it hasn't been assessed by judges and by courts. There's just too much evidence. It's too overwhelming. They can't understand it. They can't interpret it. And that's why it's never been looked at. And so, however long this goes on for, it is just going to be more of this continuing to produce what appears to be voluminous but is completely incomprehensible information that actually is completely devoid of any content.
Okay, let's move on to COVID now. Just a quick update on numbers. 123,000 cases a day, 450 deaths a day. 34 states have more than 1,000 cases a day at the moment. Having said that, the hospitalisations, they may have topped out. They may, we'll see. They certainly have levelled out the last couple of days, but they might go up again. The reason I say that is because countries like the UK had quite a sharp spike with Delta when it came. It came and went quite quickly. The US is already overdue for that spike to start to dissipate, but it hasn't yet. So we'll just keep watching, see what happens. Florida's leading with cases averaging over 20,000 a day, although they do report sporadically, so you never quite know what's going on there. Florida, this is a stat I used in the show, but I think you guys will be interested if you don't watch the show. Florida has more hospitalisations per capita at the moment, 71 per 100,000, than New York did at its peak last year, 70. Like that when everything was out of control and going crazy, and there were fridge trucks driving along the streets with cadavers in New York. Florida's got more hospitalisations now than then, but has a tenth of the deaths, which is obviously the key number. Louisiana's even worse, arguably. In the last 2 weeks, 1% of Louisiana's entire population has caught COVID in the last 2 weeks. If Louisiana and Florida were countries, not states, they would be the number 1 and number 2 countries in the world per capita for cases per day. Having said that, I suspect from looking at some of those curves on Florida, they might be close to peaking. We'll see. Obviously vaccines make a difference in the states that they go off here. Nate Silver had a good stat a few days ago. He said over the past week, the 10 least vaccinated states are averaging 3 times as many cases per capita than the 10 most vaccinated states, 4.3 times as many hospitalisations per capita, and 6.5 times as many deaths per capita. That's a good stat. But here's the interesting thing, and I raised this in the show. I'll be interested to know if you have any theories on this. Florida is not one of those countries, states. Florida has 49% of its population vaccinated. The American average is 50%. So it's pretty much, in fact, Florida is pretty much the most vaccinated of the Trump states. Yeah. That's something that DeSantis can rightly say he pushed hard early on. Yeah. For all his flaws, on COVID, he went hard on vaccination. And yet Florida has seen 3 times as many cases, 4 times as many hospitalisations, and 2.5 times as many deaths as you would expect for a state with that level of vaccination, if you put all the states in the curve. So the question is, why? Now, DeSantis says it's seasonal. He says it's because it's hotter in Florida than other places in summer, and so they go indoors and they catch COVID indoors. That's what he's saying. If that's the case, then we can expect a similar wave in the other states in the next few months. And it is noteworthy that a bunch of the states that are red, that are low vaccination, are also very hot states in summer. Yeah. So that's potentially, I don't know, do you have a theory?
Look, it just seems to be that a combination of average vaccination or slightly below average vaccination, along with dropping every other measure that you're taking against COVID, is a recipe for a lot of infections. Now, I think we've seen in the UK that, yes, if you get to 75% of the population vaccinated, then you can open everything up without having disastrous spikes. Okay, it's bouncing around a little bit in the UK, but you haven't had the kind of surges that you've had in the US. But if you don't have that level of vaccination, if you're at 50% of the population, there seems to be a huge difference between 50% of the population and 75% of the population in terms of what you can then expect to see if you start opening everything up. 75%, I don't think it's true herd immunity, but there is a lot more collective protection in that 75% than there is in 50%. Yeah. So I think that, if you're only at 50% vaccination, you can't actually drop all of the other measures in the same way that Florida has, which is not only opening up every business, but specifically passing laws banning mask mandates. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know what mask compliance levels are in Florida, but I'm guessing that they are really among the lowest in the population. So I think that is the lesson that we're looking at. Because obviously COVID is very new. The Delta strain is very new. It's going to be a long time before there's an established science of, what kinds of thresholds are required to reach true community protection. But I think just as this sort of crude comparison of the US and the UK shows, definitely there's a lot more collective protection in 75% vaccination than there is in 50% vaccination. And so if you're at 50% vaccination, you can't open everything up to the same extent as they have in the US. And of course, in Florida, a lot of stuff was never actually closed in the first place. So, I think that that's what's going on. It's not that Florida has the lowest levels of vaccination, it's that it's got average levels of vaccination coupled with very low levels of every other measure against the pandemic. And I think it's a reminder for all of us that until you get to a certain point, vaccination on its own is not enough.
I want to give you a table, some stats on a table to support what you're saying there, which was, I put this on the show as well, but I just think this is incredible. Yeah. The UK, at the peak of their Delta wave, had 13 people in the ICU per million, all right?
Yep.
Let me read you some states here. Georgia, 69, Oklahoma, 73, Texas, 76, Nevada, 86, Alabama, 111, Missouri, 113, Mississippi, 119, Florida, 125, Arkansas, 153, Louisiana, 160. That's 12 times as many people in the ICU as Britain had at its peak, which is, I think, amazing.
Yes.
And things may get worse after Sturgis as well, because Sturgis happened last weekend.
Yes. Yeah, 700,000 people. Yeah. Yep.
I imagine not too many of them were vaccinated, and definitely zero of them would have been wearing masks. So that will be interesting. The one upside, this is a pretty minor upside of all this, is that vaccinations are going up in response to the news about what's going on. They're up to 700,000 a day at the moment. The biggest increases in first dose vaccinations since July 1, the states with no vaccinations. Arkansas is up 197%. Mississippi's up.
Chaz, is that 700,000 nationally?
Nationally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds impressive, but we're doing 100,000 a day nationally in Australia.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd
actually say US vaccinations should be about twice that number. They've got more people vaccinated. Yeah. They've got about twice as many people vaccinated as we do. So, okay, maybe I'm being a bit unfair there. But
look, at their peak, they were 3 million a day. But having said that, until quite recently, they were down to 300, 400,000. So they've kind of doubled in the last 3 weeks or so.
That is one of the few hopeful things of the last few weeks is that everywhere we do seem to be seeing increased vaccinations in response to the Delta spike. So, that's good. It's bad because it shows how scary Delta is, but at the same time, it's good that it is, that it's prompting action. Chaz, I would say over the last 18 months, one of the great failings of this podcast is that we have been far too generous to Ron DeSantis.
Yep.
Yeah. Far too generous to Ron DeSantis.
Well, I will allow you to square the ledger in a second. I'm just going to do a bit of study centre. You talked about the science of Delta. I want to bring you a little bit of it. And then let's go on mandates. And that's DeSantis territory. Okay, let's go.
God is going to square the ledger with DeSantis.
Let's just quickly go to study centre. Oh, actually, before I do that, I just note one thing which is interesting. I'm not sure it's really Biden's fault, any of what we're talking about at the moment, but the COVID numbers are starting to impact on Biden's polling. Like he was lifted by his COVID management before. Now, just two recent polls. ABC had 63% of Americans approving of Biden's handling of COVID-19, which is down from 72% in the previous poll. Quinnipiac had his handling falling from 65 to 53%. and his disapproval going from 30 to 40. I mean, still positive, but that was his tent peg until quite recently.
And, I mean, this is very analogous to approval of the president's handling of the economy, which is it's not necessarily about what the president does, it's what is the state of affairs. And that's entirely understandable and entirely predictable.
Okay, let's talk Study Centre. I just want to briefly just actually no, forget Provincetown. That was last week. I want to talk about. I'll talk about a few Delta studies going around. There was a Scottish study because this is all very new. We're trying to work out what's going on with Delta. There's a Scottish study where patients infected with the Delta were nearly twice the risk of being hospitalised compared with those infected with the early Alpha variant. The patients were also younger, although presumably that was because they weren't vaccinated. Canadian study, preliminary study, the risk of being admitted to intensive care was nearly 4 times as high with Delta variant compared to patients with other variants. They're also twice the risk of hospitalisation or death. Singapore study, about to be published in The Lancet. Patients with Delta variant face higher odds of requiring oxygen, needing intensive care or dying. As far as the vaccine Delta goes, it's a bit of a question mark. The CDC says that 99% of deaths are amongst the unvaccinated and 95% of hospitalisations are amongst the unvaccinated. But the CDC director, Walensky herself, says those numbers are based on data from January to June and, quote, they don't reflect the data we have now from the Delta variant. She won't say what that data is, but it doesn't reflect it, whatever that means. This is a big study from the UK, the REACT-1 study. Every month they survey 100,000 participants drawn at random. These are not self-reported. These are drawn at random, and then they survey them. Round 12 was May 20 to June 7, which was the beginning of the Delta wave. Round 13 was June 24 to July 12, right at the end of the Delta wave in the UK. They went from 0.15% to 0.63% of participants testing positive, so 4 times as many. Delta was responsible from 78% of the cases in the first one to 100% of the cases in the second one. The fully vaccinated went from 0.07% positive to 0.4% positive. The unvaccinated went from 0.24% positive to 1.21% positive. So what you see there is both of them were, in both situations, the unvaccinated were 3 times more likely than the fully vaccinated. So that did not change, which means that there being a higher Delta level does not necessarily influence how much more contagious it is for the unvaccinated versus the vaccinated, at least according to that.
Right, yes.
At least
yeah, absolutely. Yes.
In round 13, they estimated self-reported vaccination reduced the risk of infection by 49%, down from 64% in round 12.
Yeah.
So that suggested over time either the vaccinations were becoming less effective or Delta was having more of an impact against vaccinated people. For symptomatic infections, self-reported vaccination reduced the risk of infection by 59%, down from 83%. So there we go. Okay.
And I just want to say, look, one of the major lessons of this is if you are an entrepreneur, don't name your company after a Greek letter.
That's a great call.
I'm just thinking of Delta Airlines.
Yes, that is a very valuable lesson. Mayo Clinic study was just come out the other day. Pfizer was 76% effective overall this year, 42% effective in July. Moderna, 86% effective this year, 76% effective in July. But Pfizer in July was 85% effective against hospitalisation, and Moderna was 92% effective against hospitalisation. That's the important bit, of course. We all know with vaccines that they might not stop you getting the pandemic, but you don't want to get badly. But still, 42% effective. That's why they're starting to have booster shots potentially.
I will say, Chaz, okay,
yeah.
You've said we all know this. I would say we all know it now. I would actually say that prior to this, because of people's general understanding of vaccines was based on childhood vaccines, where it is actually possible, partly through herd immunity, to even if the vaccine doesn't provide complete protection, you collectively get complete protection altogether. I actually think that the mental model that, perhaps the majority of people were carrying around was of, vaccines stop you from getting the virus. And I think it's a legitimate PR problem for vaccines that hasn't turned out to be the case. Now, sure, that's not the fault of the vaccines. It's not the fault of vaccine experts who never would have told you that vaccines, provide complete protection. But I think that is how probably the majority of people understood that vaccines work. And yes, we've learned over time. Obviously, that's not how they work. But I think that has contributed to some level of disillusionment about vaccines, and possibly it can feed rhetoric that leads to distrust, about vaccines. Like, oh, people are vaccinated, but they're still getting it. What good? What good are vaccines anyway? So I think it is important to acknowledge that the way that vaccines work actually is quite different from probably how most people would have expected vaccines to work at the outset. Certainly thinking back on the rhetoric about vaccines that we were talking about a year ago or 18 months ago, it wasn't that they'll provide a certain percentage of protection. There was much more of a sense of, okay, people get vaccinated, they won't get the disease, and we'll all be good to go. The fact that in reality it works differently from that, as I say, not the fault of the vaccines, not the fault of the vaccine scientists or experts. And also, part of that is because we're now dealing effectively with a different virus from what we were dealing with before. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that could be contributing to some of that residual, of the people who won't get vaccinated. Part of that will be people who are seeing how it actually works in reality and thinking, we've been sold a bill of goods.
That's a great call. That is, I absolutely agree. I mean, I'll admit, I didn't realise that vaccines were like that until COVID. I had the classic, you won't get chickenpox if you get the vaccine kind of.
Well, that is basically how childhood vaccines work. Yeah. But part of that is because of the collective protection that is possible with childhood vaccines. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's probably enough on my diatribe of stats. All I'll say is that Delta now is responsible for 93.4% of new infections in America. So it's pretty much taken over. And I haven't said anything about kids, and the reason why is because it's really mixed. Some studies say that kids get Delta more frequently and worse. It's just impossible to know because we just don't know how many non-symptomatic cases of kids there have been before and after, and and now there's vaccines before there weren't vaccines. It makes it all very complicated, and the jury's really still out. We just don't know. DeSantis reckons the ratios are the same in Florida as they were before, but telling you that, DeSantis, Dave, time for you to get onto him.
Actually, I don't want to talk anymore about DeSantis, but let's talk about mandates.
Let's talk mandates. Go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very interesting development this morning, which was that an appeal by Indiana University students, I assume it was some conservative group, against the university's mask mandate actually got all the way to the Supreme Court. It wasn't dealt with by the full Supreme Court. It was only dealt with by the one justice who has responsibility for the state of Indiana. Chaz, can you guess who that is?
I'm guessing Barrett.
Yes, the justice who is from Indiana.
Yes.
Yes. And what do you think she did?
I actually don't know this story because this is more recently than I've read. I only read up to about midnight. So I am going to... I'm pretty sure the law is pretty cut and dry on this. So I think that she would have allowed the mandate.
Yes, she did. Yeah. She dismissed the appeal with no comment at all.
Yeah.
Now, this is pretty significant because universities are going to be one of the major battlegrounds around vaccine mandates and mask mandates. Yeah. Universities in general have become battlegrounds on every culture war front in America. There is, a well-funded, well-organised movement to make life very difficult for university administrators and for university staff if they're perceived as being too liberal or too left-wing. And, this is one of these issues. Outfits like Turning Point USA are encouraging this kind of action. So this is pretty significant. But a lot of universities at the same time are hamstrung by their own state legislatures. In places like Arizona, I'm not sure quite what the case is in Florida, but I imagine that universities are actually not allowed to impose mask mandates or vaccine mandates in Florida.
They're not.
Certainly not.
Yeah. They're not. Florida and Texas, they're not allowed to.
Yeah, and not allowed to in Arizona either.
Yeah.
So this is, so Indiana's a case of a state where the state hasn't prohibited the universities from having its own mandate. So it looks like in those cases, universities and presumably other institutions as well are actually going to be allowed to impose mask and vaccine mandates. But I think, as you predicted a while ago, this is just becoming a straight culture war issue.
Yeah.
There are really no dimensions left to this other than culture war at the moment. If it's what we're seeing in Texas and Arizona and Florida, it is, it just has pure culture war dimensions. Is there anything more to it than this?
I certainly don't think there's any science to it, that's for sure. I was going to say that I think it's not a surprise that Texas and Florida are central to this because Abbott and DeSantis are the two Republican governors who are most likely to run for president in 2024.
Right, yes.
Which just goes to the culture war thing.
Yeah, I don't think that Abbott has any chance whatsoever. DeSantis, as you have noted many times, is probably behind Trump the most popular figure in the entire Republican field. And I don't think it's by any means clear that Trump himself is actually going to run as much as he needs to constantly suggest that he will. So yes, it could be DeSantis running on a record of opposing any kind of mandate on masks and vaccines. And I suppose my big question at this point is, so if as a result of this, as appears to be happening at the moment, Florida suffers pretty badly from the pandemic, will that actually hurt DeSantis' prospects or not?
I think it depends. I think it depends what happens elsewhere because, like, if we take a trip back a year ago, we were saying exactly the same things about Florida, and then 4 months later, it was worse everywhere else, and DeSantis was doing laps of honour, talking about how, oh look, I got it right, and now the cycle's repeated itself. So if we're about to see it get twice as bad everywhere else, then it'll be forgotten. But if this is the last hurrah of the pandemic, and we ended with Texas and Florida being a wasteland, then that might stick to him.
I don't know that it will. I have completely lost all confidence that that would actually hurt him in a Republican primary. Maybe, it might hurt him in a presidential election, but in a Republican primary, would it actually matter?
Well, it might hurt him in the 2022 governor's race. His 2022 interests are at odds with his 2024 interests, I feel, at the moment, right now.
Yeah.
It's because, actually, let me ask you a question about, I'm going to talk more about this in a second with the mask mandates, but let me just ask you a question about the vaccine mandates. It's a little bit of a cheeky question, but I'm actually serious in a way as well, which is that there's only one place that has anything approaching a real vaccine mandate at the moment, which is New York, right? With a lot of places, like they've got their own pass system and all the rest of it, and it's worked. They had a 40% boost in vaccinations as soon as they announced it. Just like in Israel, they had a massive boost. In France, they had a massive boost. So I mean, it's worked. At the same time, there have been fake vaccination cards everywhere, and the New York app actually, a reporter found it accepted a photo of a menu from a rib restaurant as proof of vaccination. So there are some bugs there. I'll put the video. I'll put the pick up there.
Fantastic.
But having said that, I don't think that really matters because this is meant to be a nudge. It's not meant to be like a science fiction movie. It's just supposed to nudge people in that direction. And I think it's successful in that respect. But my mischievous question slightly is that in New York, you've got 40% of African Americans who have received at least one dose. 63% of Latinos have received at least one dose.
Yeah.
They don't release the numbers of white people, but I'm assuming if it's like anywhere else, it's going to be higher as well. If this was about anything else, the left would be calling this systemic racism. Like the fact that black people are being effectively discriminated against for all they can do in New York. And it's because just look at the numbers. Now I know the black people can go and get vaccinated, but like if we're talking about photo ID, say, or we're talking about anything else where you need to go and do something, otherwise you are deprived of the ability to do things, we'd go, well, here's a race problem. Is this a race problem?
I think that there are plenty of people who have pointed out that lower levels of African American vaccination are actually symptomatic, excuse the bad term, of a race problem. Like there are all sorts of deep underlying historical reasons for lower levels of trust in the medical system among African Americans. Even if something appears to be universally accessible, you have to remember that life puts all kinds of barriers in the way of universal access to people who have lower life chances, for a combination of socioeconomic reasons. So, I don't think it's far off to say lower levels of vaccination among African Americans are actually symptomatic of systemic racism, not just now, but for a long time. And I suppose the point that you're making is to then put another set of restrictions in place based on a disparity which is symptomatic of systematic racism should be something that the left is screaming is systematic racism, but is not. Yeah. I assume that's
the point I'm trying to make. Yeah. Thank you for making it for me. Yeah. Anyway, I just throw it out there, just saying, okay, I thought, oh, that's interesting. Okay. All right. Let's talk. Let's talk the mask mandates in the schools and all that kind of stuff with Florida and Texas and so forth. I'll tell you what annoys me about this. I get why some people are a bit sus on schools with masks, and I don't think they explain themselves this way, but I'll tell you why I am slightly sus about it, as in terms of it being effective, and that is that if you've got kids and you've seen them wear masks, I've got kids, I've seen them wear masks, like the cloth, it doesn't touch their skin. It's just flapping in the breeze. It's just like they're breathing stuff in, or they're playing with it constantly. Sorry, you about to say something?
It's funny, Chad, like you said, if you've seen kids wear masks, because Sydney's been in lockdown for 7 weeks, it's actually been like a very long time since I've seen a child.
Sure. Fair enough. Well,
although we're actually, I think I might have, when I've been out on walks, but they're definitely not wearing masks. They're careening around on bikes,
outdoors,
dreaming of future Olympic success in one of those juvenile delinquent sports that Australia does so well in. Sorry, just a little aside. My sudden realisation that I basically never actually see people under the age of 18 anymore.
Well, I'll be the podcast expert on kids, and I'll tell you, like they wear it as poorly as you could possibly wear a mask, right? We all know the studies. The studies say masks are effective, but they're talking about if you try to put the pandemic through the mask. The pandemic will not go anywhere near the mask the way the kids wear masks. It'll go out the side, and they're always playing with their hands. Their nose is constantly not covered. It's just a mess. And I imagine schools are exactly like that. When kids are wearing masks all day, they're always fidgeting with them. They're loose, whatever. And so I do suspect that they're not massively effective in reality, as opposed to what you would expect from studies. In reality, but having said that, by
the same token, it's often been said social distancing in schools is not going to happen. Children are chronically incapable of social distancing. If you've ever seen them on public transport, it is just not reasonable to expect children to socially distance.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Having said that, I kind of draw an analogy almost to my view of people with guns at home. I think people having guns at home is stupid as well. But I also think that I don't feel right telling someone else who is in a situation that I can't understand, like being there, seeing a criminal inside their house, knowing that the police will not get there in time, telling them, I will tell you how to defend your home. That feels wrong to me. It's like to be imposing on other people solutions that are going to affect them but not affect me, right? I see the same thing with masks. People running schools, they need to try to save their kids, right? They need to try to do something. And sure, masks might be a 5% solution in reality or a 10% solution in reality, but that's better than zero. And when people are sitting there, like I read an op-ed from one of the school superintendents in Florida who was saying, 2 of my staff died last week from COVID. A whole bunch of my staff are in quarantine. We've had more cases in the last 2 weeks than we had in the 5 months beforehand. Mm-hmm. What am I supposed to do? If I don't do something to stop this process, we are not going to have a school because there will not be enough teachers to teach. Mm. And when you're in that situation, who is Ron DeSantis to tell them, no, you can't try to protect the people under your command? That's just so, it just lacks empathy and it's just so unrealistic. And in particular, the thing that annoys me about this is that people say, oh, if you don't want to have a mask, well, you're the one who gets sick. The people who want to protect themselves, they wear masks. So it doesn't matter to you if someone who doesn't wear a mask doesn't wear a mask. That's got completely backwards. Because remember, way back when they first started masks, we learnt masks stop you spreading the disease, not stop you getting the disease. So if your kid doesn't wear a mask and they have COVID, they will spread it to the people who do wear masks.
Yes.
It's actually the weak link in this case determines the level of protection right across the board. And that's why having this whole, let everyone do what they like, just cannot work practically. And that's what pisses me off, because I feel like Ron DeSantis knows better. Yes. And he's playing dumb in this regard.
I think your guns at home analogy is way, way off, because masks in schools don't actually kill people. But I agree with the general point.
Yeah, that's fair. I concede that. But I'll tell you why I reckon that this could rebound in 2022 with DeSantis, and because there's all kinds of, I'm not sure you know this, but there's all kinds of basically civil disobedience going on in Florida and Texas. 5 cities are just ignoring Abbott in Texas. The big 5 cities are just ignoring him completely. Yes. And in Florida, there's a whole bunch of schools that are just ignoring him as well. DeSantis is talking about taking away their pay and punishing them. If they're in a situation I just described where people are dying, literally dying in their schools, that's going to look terrible. And so, yes, I think he was hoping he could bluff them, and then he could just be Mr. Hard Ass. But if he can't bluff them, he's placed in a situation where he needs to behave like a dickhead, essentially. And so I'm not sure this is working out for them. What do you reckon?
I think he's very, very comfortable when that's how he's behaving.
By the way, St. Pete polls, 62% of Floridians support mask mandates in schools, including 39% of Republicans, which is not very high, but it's higher than Ron DeSantis might think.
39% of Republicans agreeing with something that the majority of Democrats agree with. That is pretty high.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, by the way, also one other thing. We've seen the downsides of freedom of choice here with this kind of stuff. But America, what they're not doing is using the upside of the freedom of choice. And that is, why don't you let parents, if you're going to let parents potentially endanger their children with all this vaccine stuff, why don't you let parents potentially endanger their children by trying to protect them? As in, why don't you allow parents to opt in to vaccinating their children before the age of 12? I mean, like to an Australian here, you might say, well, that's ridiculous because that's insane because they haven't got the proof yet that it's safe. But we don't have the proof that it's safe about not masking as well and not getting vaccines. But they're allowed to do that. So why?
Once again, Chaz, I'm afraid that your devastating logic is going to fall on deaf ears here.
It's probably true. Probably true. Do you have anything else to say about this general topic?
No.
No? Okay, all right. I want to, just before we move off COVID, there's a couple of lame narratives out there that have been kicking around for a while that I'd love to just deal with quickly. One is the suggestion that Democrats are trying to keep the pandemic going because they love power. That's out there so much at the moment. And
do we even need to respond to this?
Well, I have a devastating response.
Okay.
like first of all, obviously that means nothing. I mean, who loves having extras from Mad Max yelling at you? Mad Max yelling at you about freedom at town halls and stuff. And I don't see Lex Luthor coveting the power to get people to wear a cloth over their face. It's a strange concept of power. But leaving that aside, let me remind you all what Republicans were saying a year ago about what Dems were about the game they were playing.
If it ends up that Biden wins in November, I hope he doesn't. I don't think he will, but if he does, I guarantee you the week after the election, suddenly all those Democratic governors, all those Democratic mayors will say, everything's magically better. Go back to work, go back to school. Suddenly the problems are solved. You won't even have to wait for Biden to be sworn in.
Okay.
Got him.
Devastating logic there. I've got them so hard. Anyway,
yeah, I mean, I remember Trump, was that Ted Cruz?
That was Ted Cruz, yeah.
Yeah, I remember Trump saying very similar things. Yes, good point. Yes, what they were actually predicting was that it would magically disappear.
Yeah. Another one that just happened yesterday, but this has been happening a lot, is people suggesting Biden and Harris are the reasons for vaccine hesitancy because they called into question a Trump vaccine way back when, last year. Now, what they're talking about, let me just play you. First of all, this is Pete Ducey asking the question today to Jen Psaki.
As the president tries to reach unvaccinated Americans, has there been any thought given, looking back, to the possibility that he may have created some vaccine hesitancy when last year, around this time, the previous administration was rushing to get a vaccine authorized, and the now president said, I trust vaccines, I trust scientists, but I don't trust Donald Trump, and at this moment, the American people can't either. So
that was the question there, and so he said faithfully what Joe Biden had said. That was the quote. And also, this is the quote from Kamala Harris from last year. Dana Bash. So let's just say there's a vaccine that's approved and even distributed before the election. Would you get it? Harris. Well, I think that's going to be an issue for all of us. I will say that I would not trust Donald Trump. And it would have to be a credible source of information that talks about the efficacy and reliability of whatever he's talking about. Then she was asked whether she'd trust Anthony Fauci. She said, I think Dr. Fauci has proven for anyone who's been watching him for years and years to put the public health of the American people as the highest priority in terms of his work and his reputation and his priority. Yes, I trust Dr. Fauci. Okay, so when you actually look at what they said, both of them clearly said they trust the scientists, they don't trust Donald Trump. If the scientists say it's a legitimate vaccine, they will trust it, which is all anyone requires, right? So it's pretty clear. Secondly, who is taking those comments from 10 months ago and hanging on to them 10 months later after everything that's happening? I can't trust the vaccine.
I can't remember either of those interviews, and I was following this pretty obsessively. But I would add third, overwhelmingly, it's Republicans who are vaccine hesitant.
Yes. Why do they care what Biden...
of them are saying, yes, I remember that interview that Kamala Harris did with Dana Bash on CNN 10 months ago. Yes. And I think I'm not getting the vaccine for that reason.
And by the way, Biden and Harris are both singularly unconvincing rhetorical people anyway, as if people are going to hold on to one thing they said, go, oh, yeah, absolutely, I'm going to take that to my grave. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, so that's stupid as well.
Anyway, so thank you for your valuable daily contributions to the discourse, Pete Ducey.
Thank you. Yes. Another one, and this is you'll see how old this one is, but I just need to deal with this because the effects of this reverberate. And there's an example just this week. Okay. This was a clip that you might have seen about 6 weeks ago now in Congress.
This paper that you were referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function.
So
let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans, right. You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly. And I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about. Okay, you get
NIH,
one person.
Let's read from the NIH definition of gain of function. This is your definition that you guys wrote. It says that scientific research that increases the transmissibility among mammals is gain of function. They took animal viruses that only occur in animals and they increased their transmissibility to humans. How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
It's a dance, and you're dancing around this because you're trying to obscure responsibility for 4 million people dying around the world from a pandemic.
That's Fauci and Paul talking about, Rand Paul talking about the gain of function thing, which is going on and on and on. And Rand Paul then uses it to suggest that Fauci is responsible for COVID. Because he's suggesting that the reason this gain of function stuff is relevant is because one of those compounds ended up becoming COVID. That's what he's suggesting, okay? And if you think that I'm stretching that too far, just have a look at the kind of shit Tucker Carlson's been coming out with.
Take it from the guy who created COVID. Watch this.
Now that we have a Delta variant.
So that's him introducing Anthony Fauci, just mentioned, and this is what Marjorie Taylor Greene came out with this week, or at least this clip came out this week.
Dr. Tony Fauci funded with your tax dollars. He funded it in the Wuhan lab, didn't he? He funded COVID-19. The gain of function research. That is his baby. That is his experiment. And he's getting to watch it in the real world like a live television show where he has the front row seat. He gets to watch what happens. So this man sent your tax dollars, my tax dollars, through a third party to the Wuhan lab where the gain of function was used to take a virus that was spread between animals and it was changed into a virus that spread between humans all over the world, has gotten people sick, and they're dying. They died and they're still dying.
All right, so that's the reason we need to take care of this just quickly, because people are running with this in a big way. So first of all, just very quickly, what does the gain of function mean? It's got a specific definition, which is what Fauci's going on about. It's when you put a small cell, I'm going to use very vague language here, but just to be for common usage. It's when you put a small cell into a big cell to make the big cell function better, okay? In this case, what they did was they put a small cell into a big cell to see if the small cell could use the big cell's functionality. It did not increase the big cell's functionality at all. That's what they did, okay? So it's not technically gain of function. Having said that, yes, that's splitting hairs. Like what Rand Paul's talking about when he talks about gain of function is not the very definition of gain of function. He's talking about playing Frankenstein with viruses. That's what he's talking about. And that's what he means. And that's what everyone's talking about when they say, oh, they shouldn't do that. They mean don't play Frankenstein with viruses, which they were. But it wasn't the definition of gain of function, which is what Anthony Fauci's trying to say. Now, different scientists argue about whether you call it gain of function or not, depending on particular definitions. Zero scientists say that this led to COVID, right? Everyone says that the compounds they were dealing with had nothing to do with COVID. Zero to do with COVID. And that's really, really important to emphasize. So I just wanted to ram that home because, and if Rand Paul cared about the Frankenstein thing, I would say that's a legitimate point to make, that we need to watch out what we do, because you can create superbugs by playing Frankenstein with viruses, especially when you're dealing with poor security, poor biosecurity like you can get in China, like you can get anywhere. You need to be careful with that kind of stuff, right? That would be a fine point. But clearly, he's not making that point. He's using it to peg his way to blame Fauci for COVID. And he
By the
denies
way, Rand Paul is a perennial presidential candidate as well.
That is true.
He's never going to be president, but he always dreams that he can get back in and get back into the field and he sees this as his ticket. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I have just gotten the wrap up from the studio, so I'm just going to just play my rejoinder to all things involving Rand Paul, which is whenever you play a Rand Paul clip, especially this kind of shit, you need to play this.
For that, we'll go ahead to our next question now. Mrs. Alexis Toon, you are live with the Senator. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Senator. I am a proud Kentucky citizen, and I just wanted to tell you to get fucked.
All right, we'll go ahead to our next question.
Okay. So yes, I feel like that's a wonderful note to end on. Is there anything else you'd like to say quickly before we go, Dave? Or?
Technically not a question. We can talk next week about why it is the case that 19 Republican senators actually voted for the $1 trillion bill. I think it's quite complicated, but I do have some thoughts about how this was able to happen. I would love for us to talk about that. And also, I'm going to try and read the IPCC report this week and give you guys my thoughts on that next week as well. I'll just leave you with one little thing in the homework. You should, if you're interested in the Amy Cooper, Christian Cooper thing from a year ago, do you remember the lady, the standoff in the park between the lady who had her dog walking, her dog. Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, yes. And she called the police and said an African American man is threatening. Yeah. Anyway, Barry Weiss followed that up on her podcast, followed up the whole story, and it was really, really interesting. I don't think that she actually did exonerate Amy Cooper, as if you listen to it, you'll see what I mean. But I thought she added a lot of texture to the story that did not exist at all in the news coverage, which I think is... Nothing could induce me to listen to Barry Weiss. Nothing. That's fair enough. Until next week, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.